Section 5 of the Supernatural in Modern English Fiction by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3, Part 2. Another point of contrast between the modern and the older ghosts is in the greater freedom enjoyed by those of today. The ghosts of our ancestors were weak and helpless creatures in the main, and the Gothic spectre was tyrannized over to such an extent that he hardly dared call his shade his own. The spook of today has acquired a latchkey and asserted his independence. He may have a local habitation, but he isn't obliged to stay there. Nowadays, even the spectral women are setting up to be feminists and have privileges that would have caused the Gothic wraiths to swoon with horror. Ghosts are not so sensitive to the barometer now as they used to be, nor do they have such an active influence over the weather as did the Gothic phantoms. They do not need a tempest for their materialization, nor a supernatural play of lightning for their wild threats, and comparatively few storms occur in later fiction. Yet there is certainly no lessening of the ghostly thrill in consequence. Neither are the spirits of today limited to any set hours, as was the rule in Gothicism. The tyranny of the dark, the autocratic rule of 12 or 1 o'clock as the arbitrary hour for apparitions, has been removed. Catherine Fullerton Gerald shows an interesting collection of ghosts that come at 11 o'clock in the morning. Georgia Wood Pangborn brings one out on the seashore in mid-afternoon, and Kipling has various ghosts that appear in daylight and in the open air. Ghosts in modern fiction are not dependent upon a setting of sullen scenery as in Gothicism, but may choose any surroundings they like. Since modern household arrangements do not include family vaults as a general thing, and since cemeteries are inconveniently located, there is a tendency on the part of haunters to desert such quarters. Mary Wilkins Freeman and Charles Egbert Craddock each has one ghost story located in a graveyard, and The Last Ghost in Harmony is set in a burying ground, but the spectre complains loudly of the unsentimental mind of the town, which has lost interest in ghosts, and leaves in disgust. Likewise, the domination of the Gothic castles, those geist-alluring edifices, has passed away, and modern spooks are not confined to any one locality as in the past. They appear where they will, in the most prosaic places, in cheap lodging houses and hall bedrooms and bungalows, in the staterooms of steamers, on tramp ships, and so forth. Algernon Blackwood has set a number of thrilling ghost stories out in the open in the woods, in the desert sand wastes, and similar places. One effect of such realistic and unspectral setting is to give a greater verisimilitude to the events described, and the modern tale bears out Leigh Hunt's suggestion that a ghost story, to be a good one, should unite as much as possible objects as they are in life with a preternatural spirit. Yet here are ghosts that do haunt certain rooms as relentlessly as ever Gothic spectre did. The modern ghost has power over certain localities rather than mere houses or apartments. If the house he calls his own is torn down, he bides his time and haunts the new structure built on the same spot, or if no new house goes up, he hangs around and haunts the vacant lot, which is a more reprehensible procedure than the ordinary habits of spooks. One story concerns a house so persistently ghosted that its owner took it down section by section, trying to arrive at the location of the curse, but to no avail. When the whole building had been razed and the site plowed over, the ghost, undiscouraged, haunted merrily on. Then the owner left in disgust. Algernon Blackwood is fond of situations where localities are haunted by evil spirits, where a whole village is inhabited by the ghosts of long-dead witches, or secret worship that relates the experience of a man who wanders within the limits of a place made horrible by devil worshippers long dead, but lifelike, and inhabiting a house that has been torn down years before, but appears as usual, where they entrap the souls of the living for their fiendish sacrifice. Another is the record of a spirit of frightful evil that haunts a house built on the spot where an older house once stood, where diabolism lingers on to curse the living. The spirit that haunts a locality rather than one room or house has a more malignant power than the more restricted ghost, and this adds a new element of definite supernaturalism to modern fiction. But as houses are so much less permanent now than formerly, ghosts would be at a terrible disadvantage if they had to be evicted every time a building was torn down. Ghostly psychology is a fascinating study. The development of spectral personality is one of the evident facts gained from a historical survey of supernatural fiction. The modern ghost has more individuality, more distinctiveness, in the main, than his forebears. The ghosts of medievalism, of ancient superstition, and the drama were for the most part pallid, colorless beings in character, as in materialization. The ancient ghosts were more mournful than the moderns, since the state of the dead in early times was by no means enviable. The most one could hope for then was Hades, while the spirits who hadn't been buried couldn't find entrance even there, but were forced by relentless spectral police to keep forever moving. The Christian religion furnishes a more cheerful outlook, so in later manifestations the gloom is considerably lightened. Yet even so, the Gothic ghosts were morbid, low-minded specters, not much happier than the unlucky wights they felt it their business to haunt. Their woe-begone visages, their clanking chains, and other accompaniments of woe, betokened anything but cheer. There are some unhappy spirits in recent fiction, but not such a large proportion as in the past, and there is usually some basis for their joylessness. They don't have general melancholia with no grounds for it. The ghost of the dead wife in Readjustment is miserable because she has never understood her husband, either in life or in death, and she comes back, seeking an explanation. Another spectral woman is wretched because she has the double crime of murder and suicide on her soul. Poor Marley grieves because he is doomed to see the opportunities that life has offered him, to serve others, and that he has neglected, being forced to see with the clear vision of the other world the evil results of his own neglect, which is enough to make anyone wretched. A guilty conscience is like the burning heart that each spirit in the Hall of Eblis bore in his breast. In The Roll Call of the Reef, the troop of drowned soldiers, infantry, and horsemen come rising out of the surf to answer to their names. Each man is asked by name, "How is it with you?" and answers with the deadly sin that has damned him. In Wilkie Collins' gruesome tale, there is one spirit that is unhappy because his body lies unburied, a recurrence of a theme frequent in classical stories and Gothic romance, but rare in later fiction. For the most part, the later ghosts are something more than merely unhappy spirits. They are more positive, more active, more individualistic, too philosophical to waste time in useless grieving. Nor are there many simply happy spirits, perhaps because the joyous souls are likely to seek their paradise and forget about the earth. Yet there are instances, such as the light-hearted spirits of children in various stories, that with the resilience of childhood shake off gloom and are gay. Rosamond, that comes back to tell her friend how happy the other life is, the peacefully content mother, and others. The ghosts that are actively vicious are the most vivid and numerous in later fiction. The spirits of evil seem to have a terrible cumulative force, being far more maleficent than the earlier ones, and more powerful in carrying out their purposes. Every aspect of supernaturalism seems to be keyed up to a higher pitch of terror. Evil seems to have a strangely greater power of immortality over that of good, judging from the proportion employed in modern fiction. Has evil so much more strength of will, so much more permanence of power, that it lives on through the years and centuries, while good deeds perish with the body? It would appear so from fiction. The ghosts of good actions do not linger round the abode of the living to any noticeable extent, but evil deeds are deathless. We have many stories of places and persons haunted by the embodied evil of the past, but few by the embodied good. The revenge ghosts outnumber the Grateful Dead by legions. Modern specters have a more complex power than the old. They are more awful in their import, for they haunt not merely the body but the soul. The wicked spirits will to work dreadful harm to the soul as well as the body, and drive the victim to spiritual insanity, seeking to damn him for the life everlasting, making him not merely their victim, but through eternity their co-worker in awful evil. The victim of the vampire, for instance, who dies as a result of the attack, has to become in his turn a loathsome vampire to prey on other souls and bodies. Blackwood's devil-worshippers seek to kill the soul as well as the body of their victim. The deathlessness of evil is shown in Lytton's and in many of Blackwood's stories, as where the psychic doctor says to a man, "You are now in touch with certain violent emotions, passions, purposes, still active in this house, that were produced in the past by some powerful and evil personality that lived here." Few writers have equaled F. Marion Crawford in the modern ghost story. His tales have a curdling intensity, a racking horror that set them far above the ordinary supernatural fiction. They linger in the mind long after one has tried in vain to forget them, if indeed one ever does forget their sense of evil power. There is in each of his stories an individual horror that marks it as distinct from its fellows. A power chiefly won by delineation of this immortality of evil, as in the dead smile, with its description of the hideous smile that pollutes the lips of the living and of the dead. Nurse MacDonald said that when Sir Hugh Ockram smiled, he saw the faces of 2 women in hell, 2 dead women he had betrayed. His vicious impulses last after death, and from his grave he reaches out to curse his own children, seeking to drive them to awful, though unconscious, sin. Henry James has drawn for us 2 characters of unmitigated evil in Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, who, he says, are hovering, prowling, blighting presences. They are agents on whom is laid the dire duty of causing the air to reek with evil. He says, "I recognize that they are not ghosts at all, as we now know the ghost, but goblins, elves, imps, demons." The essence of the matter was the villainy of the motive in the evoked predatory creature. What he wishes to do in this story is to express a general sense of spiritual infamy, not specialized, as the hot breath of the pit usually confines itself to some one particular psychical brutality, but as capable of everything, the worst that can be conceived. How well he has succeeded in his effort, those who know the story can testify. Ambrose Bierce's stories are in many instances remarkable examples of this psychic horror. The death of Halpin Frasier has a touch of almost unbearable dreadfulness. Frasier is assaulted by an evil spirit in a wood at night and choked to death, the spirit inhabiting the dead body of the man's own mother, who has idolized him. His dead mother's face, transfixed with diabolical hate, is thrust upon him, and the loved hands that have caressed him strangle him. This is similar to the situation of an evil spirit occupying the body of a loved dead mother in The Mummy's Tale by Elliot O'Donnell. Bierce's stories beat upon the mind like bludgeons, and his morbid plots are among the most dreadful in our literature. One wonders what abnormality of mind conceives such themes, evolves such situations. If it be true, as Macaulay suggests, that not only every poet but every person who appreciates poetry is slightly unbalanced mentally, surely every writer of such extreme and horrific stories must be abnormal. There is more than one writer of modern ghostly fiction of whom it might be said that his soul is open on the hell side. Another temperament found distinctly in the later fiction is the humorous ghost. He is a recent development, and as might be supposed is characteristically American. There were a few burlesque ghosts in Elizabethan drama, the ghost of Jack, for instance, and one colored ghost that would seem to connote mirth, but the really humorous spectre did not come till later. It remained for the Yankee to evoke the spook with a sense of humor. Ghosts are not essentially laughable, and to make them comic without coarseness or irreverence is an achievement. Numerous writers have busied their pens with the funny spook, and now we have ghostly laughter that is mirthful and not horizonous, as in other types. Spectres now laugh with us instead of at us, and instead of the mocking laughter heard in lonely places, we have the heart-easing mirth. Washington Irving evokes several humorous hoax ghosts, such as the Headless Horseman that created excitement in Sleepy Hollow, and the serenading phantom in The Spectre Bridegroom. Richard Middleton, in his Ghost Ship, shows some very formal humorous ghosts. The girls and boys rise from their graves to flirt over their tombstones on moonlight nights, and the children play with the village spectres as companions, their favorite being the man that sits on the well curbing, with his severed head held in his hands. The cottagers rebuke the spooks overhead when they grow too noisy, and a general good fellowship prevails. Into this setting the ghost ship sails one night, anchoring itself in the middle of a turnip patch, and the riotous captain demoralizes the men of the village, ghosts and all, with his rum and his jokes. After a stay of some time, one night in a storm, the villagers look out. Over our heads, sailing very comfortably through the windy stars, was the ship that had passed the summer in Landlord's Field. Her portholes and her windows were ablaze with lights, and there was a noise of singing and fiddling on her decks. They do say that since then the turnips on Landlord's Field have tasted of rum. Oliver Harper tells of a reporter who was invited by a cordial spook, who has been a New York social leader, to a spectral banquet and ball underneath Old Trinity. She satirizes human foibles and weaknesses, showing ghosts that gossip and gormandize, simper and swear as they did in life. They learn to play poker, dance, and kill time as they used to do. Frank R. Stockton has written several delicious drolleries of supernaturalism, as The Transferred Ghost, where the spook of a living man, the irascible uncle of the charming Madeline, terrifies the young suitor who lacks courage to propose. The audacious and ever-present ghost swings his feet from the porch railing, invisible to the girl as inaudible by her, and breaks in on the conversation in a most disconcerting way. The young man at last cries out in desperation, "What are you waiting for? I have nothing to say to you." Whereat the girl, who has been undoubtedly waiting to hear the proposal the embarrassed youth was trying to make, thinks he is speaking to her and departs in high dudgeon. On a later occasion, the spectre comes to announce to him that he has got his transfer, and may be somebody else's ghost instead of that, the man who was expected to die and didn't, when the lover cries out, "I wish to heaven you were mine!" And Madeline, melting in a sigh, whispers, "I am yours." The sequel to this is also comic. Brander Matthews has several stories of humorous supernaturalism, rival ghosts being the account of ancestral spooks belonging to a young bridegroom, and who resent being brought into enforced companionship by a sudden elevation to a title, since one ghost must haunt the house and one the heir. The ingenious groom, at last harassed to invention by the continual squabbling of the ghosts, brings about a wedding between them. This is the only instance I have found of a wedding between two spectres, though there are various cases on record of marriage between one living and one spectral personage. John Kendrick Bangs devotes several volumes to the doings and sayings of spooks, describing parties in a houseboat on the Styx, where the shades of the departed great gather together and engage in festivities and discussions, and showing types of water ghosts and various kinds of spooks. The humorous ghost is a more frequent person than one would suppose without giving some thought to the subject, for many writers have sharpened their wits on the comic haunt. As may be seen from the examples mentioned, the ghost has made perceptible progress in psychology. The modern apparition is much more complex in personality than the crude early type, and shows much more variety. The up-to-date spook who has a chance to talk things over with William James and knows the labyrinths of the human mind is much better adapted to inflict psychical terrors than the illiterate spectre of the past. He can evolve mental tortures more subtle and varied than ever, or he can amuse a downcast mortal by his gambols. Stories of today show a decided advance over the Gothic in the matter of motives for spectral appearance. There are, it is true, certain motives in common between them, but the present-day spirit is less limited, for he has gained the new without loss of the old, if he wishes to keep the old. The principal impulse that impelled classical shades to walk the earth was to request burial, since lacking that he could not enter into the abode of the dead. This appears frequently also in Gothic romance. It is shown but little in recent fiction, perhaps because the modern ghost is reconciled to cremation, or is blithely indifferent to what becomes of his body, since it no longer rules him. The Queen of Hearts is one of the few instances of its use in modern fiction, for it is a vanishing motive for the most part. Gothic ghosts were also wont to return to show the hiding place of treasure, but that too is dying out as an incentive to haunting. The prosaic explanation here may be that now persons put their treasure in safety deposits, hence there is scant occasion for mystery concerning its location after death. Gothic spooks came back on occasion to reveal parentage, for parents, like valuables, were frequently mislaid in terror romance. This is not so important now, since vital statistics usually keep such matters duly recorded, yet instances do sometimes occur. Ghosts in the terror romance came to make requests, apart from the petition for burial, which tendency is still observed on the part of later spooks, though not to the same extent as formerly. The requests are psychologically interesting, as they usually relate to simple ties of affection, illustrated by the mother spirit, who asks her friend to take her children. Gothic spirits came back often to make revelations concerning the manner of their death, which is not often the case now, though it does sometimes happen. And Dickens shows us one ghost returning to influence the jury that is trying a man for murder. Spectres used to appear to forewarn the living against impending danger, which impulse is rather lacking in later fiction, though it still occurs. The curious element of futurity enters into several of these ghostly warnings, as in Dickens's The Signalman, where the apparition presages the man's death, as in Algernon Blackwood's story is related the incident of a man who saw the two Indians scalp a white man and drag his body away, at last crying out, "I saw the body, and the face was my own." Warning spirits of futurity are seen in On the Stairs, where each man beholds his own destiny. One sees the spectral snake that afterwards kills him in a hunting expedition. One, the ghost of a Zulu, the savage that almost destroys him some time afterwards. And the last, the ghost of a young woman in a blue dress, the woman whom he marries and who hounds him to his death. She presently sees her own fate too, but what it is the author does not tell us. One curious incident in the story is the instantaneous appearance on the stairs of the woman herself and her ghostly double, one in a white dress, one in the fatal blue. This sort of spectral warning, this wireless service for the conveyance of bad news and hint of threatening danger, serves to link the ghost story of the present with those of the past. The records of the Psychical Society show hundreds of such instances, and much use is made in fiction of plots hinging on such motif. Scott's White Lady of Avenel appears as a death portent, as also the Bargeist in another novel. The revenge ghost looms large in fiction as in the drama. He was the most important figure in Elizabethan as in classical drama, and Shakespeare's ghosts are principally of that class. A terrible example of the type is in Robert Lovell Beddoes' Death's Jest Book, that extraordinary example of dramatic supernaturalism, where the ghost of the murdered man comes back embodied from the grave, and is an active character to the end of the play. He is summoned to life through a hideous mistake, the murderer having asked the magician to call up the spirit of his dead wife, but the body of his victim having been secretly buried beside her so that the murderer may have no rest even in the grave. The awful accusing spirit rises to confront him instead of his wife's phantom. The revenge ghost is both objective and subjective in his manifestation, and his impelling motive adds a touch of frozen horror to his appearance. He appears in various forms, as dismembered parts of the body, illustrated, in the stories above referred to, in a horrific invisibility, in a shape of fear visible only to the guilty, or in a body so objectified as to seem absolutely real and living to others beside the one haunted. The apparently casual, idle figure that strolls about the docks and streets in The Detective, seen by different persons and taken for a man interested only in his own pursuits, is a revenge ghost, to whose face is rigid with mad horror. He has come back in physical embodiment to avenge the betrayal of his daughter. Ambrose Bierce shows us many spirits animated by cold and awful revenge, sometimes visible and sometimes unseen, as where a soldier killed for striking an officer answers, "Here!" to the roll call, just at which moment a mysterious bullet from nowhere strikes the officer through the heart. Crawford sends a drowned sailor back in wet oilskins to slay his twin brother, who has impersonated him to win the girl they both loved. When the two bodies wash ashore, one is a newly dead corpse, the other a skeleton in oilskins, while the dreadful rattle of the accusing lump of lead in the wife's skull in another story is a turn of the screw of her horrid revenge. The revenge ghost in modern fiction is more varied in forms of manifestation, at times more subtle in suggestion and ghostly psychology than the conventionalized type of the drama, and remains one of the most dreadful of the forms of fear. In general, the modern stories show a greater intensity of power in employing the motives that earlier forms had used, as well as far greater range of motivation. The earlier ghosts were limited in their impulses, and their psychology was comparatively simple. Not so with the apparitions of today. They have a far wider range of motives, are moved by more complex impulses and mixed motivation, in many cases difficult to analyze. The Gothic ghost had some conscience about whom he haunted. He had too much reserve to force himself needlessly upon those that had no connection with his past. If he knew someone that deserved punishment for wrong done him or his, he tried to haunt him and let others alone. The modern ghost is not so considerate. He is actuated in many cases by sheer evil that wreaks itself upon anyone in range. Death gives a terrible immortality and access of power to those whose lives have been particularly evil, and the results are dangerous to society. Dark, discarnate hate manifests itself to those within reach. Algernon Blackwood would have us believe that all around us are reservoirs of unspeakable horror, and that any moment of weakness on our part may bring down the hosts of damnation upon us. This is illustrated in such stories as With Intent to Steal, where the spirit of a man who has hanged himself comes back with hypnotic power, forcing others to take their lives in the same way. Or in another, showing power exerted viciously against human beings in a certain building. Or still another, where the witchcraft holds the village in thrall, and elsewhere. Ambrose Bierce, Bram Stoker, F. Marion Crawford, and Arthur Machen have written a number of stories bringing out this side of ghostly psychology, showing the bands of outlawed spirits that prey on society. There are spectral bandits and bravos that answer the call of any force hostile to man, or act of their own accord from an impulse of malicious mischief. The jealous ghost is somewhat common of late, showing that human emotions are carried over into the life beyond. In various stories we find the dead wife interfering to prevent a second marriage, or to make life wretched for the interloper, even after the ceremony. But the most extreme case of jealousy, even exceeding the instance of the man whose wife and physician conspired to give him an overdose to put him out of the way, and who is frantic to prevent their marriage, is found in Arnold Bennett's novel The Ghost. Here the spirit of a man who has madly loved an opera singer haunts every suitor of hers, and either drives him to abandon his courtship or kills him, till finally the singer begs the ghost to spare the man she loves, which he sadly does, and departs. This is reminiscent of one of Marie de France's lays. The varying motives for appearance may be illustrated by reference to a few ghosts in modern fiction, such as the woman who comes to drive away a writer's sense of humor, than which there could be no greater spiritual brutality, and set him to writhing vile, debased tragedies. Perhaps she has transferred her attentions to other authors than the one in the story. Other instances are the little gray ghost in Cornelia A. P. Comer's story by that name, who impels a stranger to take her child from an orphan asylum and adopt it, much against his will. The immortal lovers that haunt a woman who has made a marriage of convenience, which has turned out to be a marriage of inconvenience for her husband. The talkative spook in Andrew Lang's In Castle Perilous, that discourses learnedly on its own materialization, speaking in technical terms, pokes fun at Shakespeare for the glowworm on a winter night, and the cockcrow in his Hamlet, but these are perhaps enough. If one may judge from ghostly fiction, death subtracts nothing from human emotion, but rather adds to it, so that the spectral impulses are more poignant and intense. The darker passions are retained with cumulative power, and there is a terrible immortality of hate, of jealousy, and revenge. There is no more impressive revenant than one Coleridge gives in his Wanderings of Cain, the mournful phantom of Abel appearing to Cain and his little son Enos. The child says to his father, "I saw a man in unclean garments, and he uttered a sweet voice full of lamentations." Cain asked the unhappy spirit, "But didst thou not find favor in the sight of the Lord thy God?" To which the shape answers, "The Lord is God of the living only. The dead have another God." Cain ran after the shape, and the shape fled shrieking over the sands, and the sands rose like white mists behind the steps of Cain, but the feet of him that was like Abel disturbed not the sands. One of the most interesting phases of comparative ghost lore is the study of the intricate personality of specters. With respect to dual personality, the late supernatural stories are curiously reminiscent of the animistic belief that a ghost is a double of the mortal, a vapory projection of his actual body to be detached at will during life and permanently at death. I do not know of any instances of doubles in classical literature, nor is the idea used in Gothic romance. Likewise, Shakespeare's ghosts are all spirits of persons safely dead. It remained for the modern writer, with his expertness in psychology and psychiatry, to evoke the ghosts of the living persons, the strange cases of dual personality, and of separate personalities supernaturally merged into one, and those inexplicable ghosts of subliminal memories. All these forms appear in elusive analysis, in complex suggestiveness, in modern uncanny stories, and constitute one of the distinct marks of advance over the earlier types. The double, a frequent figure in English fiction, bears a resemblance to the doppelganger of German folktales. Numerous examples of dual personality, of one being appearing in two forms, are seen with different twists to the idea, yet much alike. It has been suggested that these stories have their germinal origin in Calderon's play, where a man is haunted by himself. Poe's William Wilson is a tense and tragic story of a man pursued by his double, till in desperation he kills him, only to realize that he has slain his better self, his conscience. His duplicate cries out, "Henceforth thou art dead, dead to the world, to heaven and to hope. In me thou didst exist, and in my death see by this thine image, which is thine own, how utterly thou hast murdered thyself." Stevenson's Markheim shows in the person of the stranger the incarnate conscience, an embodiment of a man's nobler self that leads him through the labyrinth of self-examination to the knowledge of the soul's truth. The stranger tests the murderer by offering him a way of escape, by suggesting further crime to him, by showing him relentlessly what the consequence of each act will be, till in despair, Markheim, realizing that his life is hopelessly weak and involved, decides to surrender it rather than to sin further. Step by step, the nameless visitor leads him, Markheim shuddering back from the evil that is suggested, thinking the stranger is a demonic tempter, till at last the transfigured face shows him to be the nobler angel. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is, of course, the best-known instance of this sort of dual personality, this walking forth in physical form of the evil in one's own nature, with a separate existence of its own. No writer could hope to express this idea more powerfully than has been done in this chemical allegory, this biological dissection of the soul, the thrill of suspense, the seemingly inexplicable mystery, the dramatic tenseness of the closing scenes make this sermon in story form unforgettable. Kipling has given a striking story of a man haunted by his own phantom body in At the End of the Passage. His own figure slipped silently before him as he went through his lonely house. When he came in to dinner, he found himself seated at the table. The vision rose and walked out hastily, except that it cast no shadow. It was in all respects real. The horror of this haunting spectre of himself, this double of his own body and soul, drives the man to suicide, after which a peculiar twist of horror is given by the detail at the close of the discovery by his comrade of the man's own photograph imprinted on the dead retina and reproduced by the camera hours after his death. In Julian Hawthorne's allegory, the dead man's spirit meets the devil, who is his own evil self incarnate. Edith Wharton's Triumph of Night reveals a ghost of a living man standing behind his double's chair, visible to the person opposite and showing on the ghostly face the evil impulses that the living countenance cleverly masks. John Kendrick Bangs has his hero say, "I came face to face with myself, with that other self in which I recognized, developed to the fullest extent, every bit of my capacity for an evil life." And Blackwood relates the meeting of a musician and his ghostly double in an opera hall. Mr. Titbottom, through the power of his magic spectacles, reflects his image in a mirror, sees himself as he really is, as he looks to God, and flees horror-stricken from the sight. This symbolic representation is akin to the prophetic pictures of Hawthorne, where a woman's griefs and marks of age are shown in her pictured face before they are revealed in her actual experience, a pictured futurity. The most impressive instance of this relation between a human being and his portrait is in Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, that strange study of a man's real nature expressing itself on his painted likeness, while the living face bears no mark of sin or shame or age until the tragic revelation at the end. Edith Wharton also represents a supernatural dualism, the woman statue showing on its marble face the changing horror of her own stricken countenance. The White Sleep of Auber Hearn is a curious story of a spiritual double, a psychological study of a man who was in two places at once, seen by various persons who knew him in each case, being killed in a train wreck many miles away from his room where he was lying asleep in his bed, a sleep that knows no waking. Distinct from the expression of one personality in two bodies, the supernatural merging of two separate personalities into one appears in recent ghostly fiction. It forms a subtle psychologic study and is uncannily effective. H.G. Wells' Story of the Late Mr. Elvesham is a peculiar narrative of a transfer of personality as the result of a mysterious drink, by which an old man takes possession of a young man's body, leaving the youth to inhabit the worn-out shell of the dotard. Algernon Blackwood, in The Terror of the Twins, describes a supernatural merging of two natures into one by the power of a dead father's insane curse. The younger son loses his vitality, his mind, his personality, all of which is supermortally given to his older brother, while the deprived son dies a driveling idiot of sheer inertia and utter absence of vital power. Mary Heaton Vorse describes a neurotic woman who comes back from the grave to obsess and possess the interloper in her home, through the immortal force of her jealousy, making the living woman actually become the reincarnation of the dead wife. This story naturally suggests Poe's Ligeia, which is the climax of ghostly horror of this motif, with its thesis that man doth not yield himself to the angels, nor unto death utterly save through the weakness of his own feeble will, expressed in a terrible crescendo of ghastly horror. Poe's Morella is a similar study of the supernatural merging of an exterior personality into a living body, where the dead mother and her child are literally one flesh and one spirit. Blackwood's The Return is an example of the compact ghost that comes back at the hour of death to reveal himself to his friend as he long ago promised he would. The dead artist manifests himself through a sudden and wonderful realization of the beauty of the world to which the materialistic friend has heretofore been blinded and indifferent. Feeling this sudden, rapturous sweeping of beauty through his soul, the living man knows that his artist friend is dead, and that his spirit has become a part of his own being. In the same manner, the little lonely soul in Granville Barker's wonderful piece of symbolism, Souls on Fifth, enters into the being of the man who is the understanding heart and continues her existence as a part of him. An essentially modern type of ghost story is that which has its explanation on the basis of subliminal memories. It seems that all around us are reservoirs of ancestral memories, records of the vital thoughts and actions of the long dead, psychical incarnations of their supreme moments, their striking hours, into which the living at times stumble and are submerged. Some slightly spiritual accident may bring down upon mortals the poignant suffering and bliss of the dead, in whose personality they are curiously duplicated. These ghosts of dead selves from the past are different from the doubles that are projections of the living, or prophetic specters of the future, and are clearly distinguished. The Borderland, by Francis Parsons, tells of a young army officer who is obsessed by subliminal self, the ghost of his grandfather. He feels that he is his grandfather, living another existence, yet he lacks the pluck, the manhood, that the old pioneer possessed. At a crisis in his military affairs, the old frontiersman comes visibly forward to give him the courage that is needed, after which he manifests himself no more. The scene of this subliminal haunting is a Texas prairie, during a border fight, rather, an unghostly setting, yet one which makes the supernatural seem more actual. Arthur Johnson presents the case of a man who sees the ghosts of ancestral memory in a vivid form. He sees and hears his own double wildly accuse his wife, who is the double of his own betrothed, after having killed her lover. His hand is wounded, and the fingers leave bloodstains as they snatch at the gray chiffon round his wife's throat. After a fit of unconsciousness, into which he falls over, the modern man awakes to find his hand strangely wounded, and on the floor of the upper room he picks up a scrap of blood-stained gray chiffon. Blackwood's Old Clothes shows a little girl obsessed by subliminal memories. She is haunted by terrible experiences, in which she says that she and some of those around her have been concerned. She goes into convulsions if anything is fastened around her waist, and she cries out that some cruel man has shut her up in the wall to die, and has cut off Philip's hands so that he cannot save her. Investigations bring to light the facts that a long-dead ancestress, living in the same house, had been walled up alive by her husband after he had cut off her lover's hands before her face. The skeleton is found chained by the waist inside the ancient wall. Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries depicts the ghosts of buried life, of a whole village enchanted by the past and living over again the witchcraft of the long ago. As John Silence, the psychic doctor, tells of the Englishman who drops casually into the village and is drawn into the magic, Vezin was swept into the vortex of forces arising out of the intense activities of a past life, and lived over again a scene in which he had often played a part centuries ago. 4 strong actions set up forces that are so slow to exhaust themselves that they may be said, in a sense, never to die. In this case they were not complete enough to render the illusion perfect, so the little man was confused between the present and the past. That story of unusual psychical experience, An Adventure, by 2 Oxford women, can be explained on no other basis than some such theory as this. The book claims to be a truthful account of a happening at Versailles, where 2 English women, teachers and daughters of clergymen, saw in broad daylight the ghosts of the past, the figures of Marie Antoinette and her court. The writers offer the explanation that they stumbled into a sort of pocket of the unhappy queen's memories, and saw the past relived before their eyes because she had felt it so keenly and vividly long ago. Other instances might be given, but these are sufficient to illustrate the type. Such stories have a curious haunting power and are among the most effective narratives. The idea is modern and illustrates the complexity of later thought as compared with the simplicity of earlier times. A comparative study of ghost stories leads one to the conclusion that the ghost is the most modern of ancients and the most ancient of moderns. In some respects, the present spectre is like, and in some unlike, the previous forms. Ghosts, whether regarded as conjective or purely subjective, are closely related to the percipient's thoughts. Primitive times produced a primitive supernaturalism, and the gradual advance in intellectual development has brought about a heightening and complexity of the weird story. 'Tis in ourselves that ghosts are thus and so. The spook of today is of a higher nervous organization than his forebears. In many instances, the latter-day ghost is so distracted by circumstances that he hardly knows where he's at, as, for instance, the ghost in such case as The Tryst by Alice Brown, where a man is thought to be drowned and his ghost comes out to comfort his sweetheart, only to have the drowned man brought back to life presently. And in The Woman from Yonder by Stephen French Whitman, where a scientist with impertinent zeal brings life back to the body of a woman who has bled to death while Hannibal was crossing the Alps and been buried in a glacier till the glacier spat her out. Now, what was the status of those ghosts? Was there a ghost if the person wasn't really dead? But if a woman isn't dead after she has been in an ice pack for 2,000 years or thereabouts, what surety is there for the standing of any ghost? The apparitions of today have more lines of interest than the ancient ghosts. The Gothic spectre was a one-idea creature with a single-track brain. He was not a ghost of all work, as are some of the later spooks. He was a simple-souled being who felt a call to haunt somebody for some purpose or other. So he just went and did it. The specters of today are more versatile. They can turn their hand to any kind of haunting that is desired and show an admirable power of adaptability, though there are highly developed specialists as well. The psychology of the primitive ghost and of the Gothic spectre was simple. They knew only the elemental passions of love and hate. Gothic spooks haunted the villain or villainess to foil them in their wicked designs, or punish them for past misdeeds, or hovered over the hero or heroine to advise, comfort, and chaperone them. But the modern ghosts are not satisfied with such sit-by-the-fire jobs as these. They like to keep in the van of activity, and do what mortals do. They run the whole scale of human motions and emotions, and one needs as much handy psychology to interpret their hauntings as to read George Meredith. They are actuated by subtle motivations of jealousy, ardent love, tempered friendship, curiosity, mischief, vindictiveness, revenge, hate, gratitude, and all other conceivable impulses. The Billy Sunday sort of ghost who wants to convert the world, the philanthropic spirit who wants to help humanity, the socialist spectre that reads the magazine, the friendly visitor that sends its hands back to wash the dishes, the little shepherd lad that returns to tend the sheep, are among the new concepts in fiction of the supernatural. The ghost of awful malice, to be explained only on the basis of compound interest of evil, stored up for many years, is a new force. Though the ghostly narrative has shifted its center of gravity from the novel to the short story since Gothic times, and many more of the modern instances are in that form, the supernatural novel has recently taken on a new lease of life. Honors are almost even between the English and the American ghost story, as most of the representative writers on each side turn their pen at some time to write terror tales. The ghost has never lost his power over the human mind. Judging from the past, one may say that the popularity of the ghost story will continue undiminished, and will perhaps increase. Certainly there has been a new influx of stories within later times. What mines of horror yet remain untouched for writers of the future? It would be hard to say, yet we do not fear for the exhaustion of them, for the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out the spine is an awesome joy. For ourselves, we are content for the present to function on one plane, but we love to adventure on another plane through spectral substitutes. We may give up the mortal, but will not willingly give up the ghost. We love him. We believe in him. Our attitude towards specters is much like that of the little black boy that Ellis Parker Butler tells about in Dey Ain't No Ghosts, who sees a terrifying array of all the spirits in the world, and all the haunt in the world, and all the goblins in the world, and all the specters in the world, and all the ghosts in the world, come out to bring a fearsome message to a frightened pickaninny. The king of the ghosts, what name old Skull and Bones, he place his hand on the head of little black Mose, and the hand feel like a wet rag, and he say, "Dey ain't no ghosts," and one of the hairs on his head of little black Mose turn white, and the monstrous big haunt what his name was Bloody Bones, he lay his hand on the head of little black Mose, and he hand feel like a toadstool in the cool of the day, and he say, "Dey ain't no ghosts." And another one of the hairs what of the head of little black Mose turn white, and a heejus spirit what his name Moldy Palm place his hand on the head of little black Mose, and his hand feel like the yunner side of a lizard, and he say, "Dey ain't no ghosts." And so on through the assembly. Small wonder that the terrified youngster is loath to go up to the loft to bed alone that night, and demurs, to the demand. So he ma, she say, "Get her along with you, what you skeered of when they ain't no ghosts?" And little black Mose, he scrooge and he twist and he pucker up his mouth and he rub his eyes, and pristinely he say right low, "I ain't scared of the ghosts, what am, 'cause they ain't no ghosts." "Then what am you scared of?" asked his ma. "Nuffin," says the little black boy, what his name of Mo, "but I just feel kind of uneasy about the ghosts, what ain't. Just like white folks, just like white folks." End of chapter 3.